Okay, now sometimes we forget stuff. Amnesia is a special case of forgetting stuff. Amnesia is when you have some kind of biological damage that prevents you from accessing your memories. So the memories are in your long-term memory storage, and something physical is preventing you from being able to retrieve. Now, retrograde amnesia is when you have an inability to retrieve old memories that you've previously stored. So things that you know, they're stored away in your long-term memory, and you no longer can get to them. This kind of amnesia is most likely to occur like with a head injury, a concussion, something like that. Anterograde amnesia is actually an inability to form new memories. So you aren't truly forgetting in the case of anterograde amnesia. You are not ever storing it into your long-term memory. Anterograde amnesia is more likely to happen when you've had some kind of brain infection than when you've had a head injury. So retrograde amnesia is more common, but anterograde amnesia is more long-lasting. Here we have an example of two cases who had, one was retrograde amnesia and the other one was anterograde amnesia. A person who's had a trauma, a brain injury, something like that, could be a stroke, it could be a lesion from surgery. In the case of a person with retrograde amnesia, they're not going to be able to pull up old memories. So the red squiggly line is the point at which the trauma or the injury occurred. The person who's had that kind of retrograde amnesia won't be able to remember anything from before the damage, but they will be able to form new memories. So going forward, they're going to be fine. They're just going to be lacking something from the past. And it might be localized. It might be, there was a classic case of a guy who got into a motorcycle accident, and he was 19 years old when it happened. When he woke up after his really protracted coma and stuff that happened, because he didn't have a helmet on or anything, when he first woke up, he truly believed he was 9 years old because he did not remember anything from between the age of 9 and 19. As he recovered and his brain swelling went down and things like that, he slowly got older. And ultimately, in the long run, the only thing he never remembered was the day of the accident. He never probably had fully encoded it before the accident happened. But that's a really good example of how retrograde amnesia works. It usually comes back as the damage goes away if you have like a concussion. If it's something due to surgery or something like that, you've lost those memories. But you have no trouble forming new memories. The reverse is true for a person who has anterograde amnesia. They can remember all the stuff that happened before their illness that caused the damage to their hippocampus, but they can't make new memories. So they live in sort of like this 30-second blinker of time, and that's it. So there are two different kinds of amnesia. Anterograde amnesia is kind of an example of encoding failure. And actually, encoding failure is the #1 reason why most of us forget most of the stuff we forget, because we never really made that last step there in this little flow chart, which is where we're supposed to encode the information from short-term memory into long-term memory. This diagram has that little square sort of blocking us having access to long-term memory. If your attention gets distracted in the middle of the encoding process, the information won't make it to long-term. If you don't get enough sleep that night, you may not make the transition from short-term into the long-term memory storage. And so you're going to forget. So here's something that we see quite frequently. I don't know how many pennies you handle anymore, but we're familiar with pennies. But have we deeply processed the components of a penny well enough that we've transferred the contents to our long-term memory? Most of us have not. Most of us looking at these pennies are like, uh-oh. I'm not sure. They all look kind of similar and viable, and oh no. A lot of times you can at least be confident that Lincoln's facing one way or the other, so you can eliminate some of them on that basis. And then you can kind of eliminate maybe based on your knowledge of the date information or other things like that, the position, right? You can narrow it down. But then it gets down to certain ones, and then you start going, I'm not sure. So I'll just put you out of your misery. This is also in the textbook. We don't process it deeply enough, so we don't know. There are a lot of things we encounter. Another popular question is, what color is the top stripe on the American flag? And it's really funny to watch everybody go, huh, as they're visualizing the flag and they're trying to figure it out. Huh, don't know. Now that's something you see frequently. Why do we have to think so hard? Because we really don't encode that deeply. There are things that we just sort of look at and don't pay attention to. Now probably more interesting to you would be, okay, no, seriously, I knew it. I knew it for more than 30 seconds. I knew it for more than 2 weeks, and now I can't find it anymore. Where to go? Well, if there was any storage decay, it probably happened pretty much immediately. As we can see in this chart, x-axis is how many days it's been since we learned the list. Pretty much everything you're going to forget, you'll forget within the first day. There'll be a little additional forgetting between day 1 and day 3, but then it pretty much levels off. In fact, if we wanted to switch those numbers from days to years, we would see that once you've leveled off, pretty much permanently, that's how much of that information you're going to remember. Storage decay happens immediately, within seconds to a couple of days, and then storage decay no longer explains what's going on. Oh, here I switched it to years for you. So here we have how much you forget within the first 3 years from your Spanish course that you took in high school, right? And then once you've dropped that first amount, it's pretty stable the rest of your life. We've got 35.5 years as our longest, labeled amount of time. That's a lot of time, and it stayed pretty much stable. I don't know what's up with the slight abnormal peak at 14.5 years. Maybe that's when their own kids went into high school Spanish too. I don't know. I don't know what that is. We call that an anomaly in the data. But the idea is if it's still there within 3 days, it's probably going to stay there. Okay, so if I knew it for 3 days, how come I can't retrieve it now? I think it must be in long-term memory because I was able to remember it for more than 3 days. Why can't I retrieve it now? And that's a whole other issue. I think that is called forgetting, right? I can't get it out. One reason why you can't get it out is because something else is interfering with it. Now, of course, it depends on what you're retrieving, how well you know what you're retrieving. Sorry. What else you know that's sort of like it. Whether you'll experience proactive or retroactive interference. Here we have a girl who is studying French, and then she's studying her Spanish, and then she's going to take a Spanish midterm. Because she already studied the French and she knew it pretty well, it's going to proactively interfere with her Spanish, so that when she takes the Spanish midterm and she's cued with what's the word for paper, what's the word for book, what's the word for pen, stuff like that, instead of producing the Spanish words, her brain wants to offer the French words. And those French words are similar enough that her brain's like, I can't sort this out, I can't figure it out, what's the thing I want? And it'll actually go with the thing it knew better and knew longer. It'll pick the French. That's proactive interference. And that happens when the thing you already know is better encoded, you already know it pretty well, it'll interfere with the new information. Sometimes the reverse happens. Sometimes you didn't really know the French that well, and maybe that's why you decided, you know what, I'm going to switch over to Spanish. I was having trouble acquiring all that, spelling nuance and stuff like that, so I'm going to go with Spanish now. So you study your French, you study your Spanish, and then for whatever reason you decide, well, I'm going to see if maybe I could test out of French. Maybe I did know it better than I thought I did. I'm going to take a test. And all your Spanish stuff that you've been studying so heavily recently keeps interfering. That's called retroactive. The newer information is interfering with your retrieval of the older information. So let's give you some more concrete examples. Okay, so let's say that you've been attending the same high school. This is like your sophomore or junior year at the same high school that you attended last year. And last year you had a locker and you memorized your combination that you were provided by the school. And everything was fine last year. Now you show up for your first day of school this year. You've got a new locker combination. You go to your new locker and proceed to try last year's combination on this locker. And you hit or miss for the first week of school. You keep accidentally starting to put in last year's locker combination into this year's locker. Or maybe you even did one step worse and went to your old locker. You're like, what am I doing over here? This isn't my locker anymore. That's an example of proactive interference. The thing that you knew better keeps interfering with the thing that you're trying to learn now, and making it difficult for you to retrieve the more recently, maybe not as well encoded information. The same thing happens the other direction, though. Once you've gotten this year's locker completely encoded and completely familiar and you're completely facile with it, you say to yourself, hey, I'm going to go over to my old locker and see if I can get it to open with my old combination. First off, you may go over to the bank of lockers where yours was, and then you're like, oh, which one was mine? Okay, now I found it. Okay, I found mine. What was my combination again? The new combination will interfere with your ability to retrieve the old one. That's what we mean by this kind of interference. It's really a matter of how well you've encoded the newer information or how well you've encoded the older information that will determine whether you do the proactive or the retroactive type of interference. Sometimes you don't want to know that information anymore. Freud says sometimes you don't want to know painful or embarrassing information, so you'll repress it. That it's still in your head, but it's in an inaccessible state. It's in your unconscious, so that you won't think about it anymore. So sometimes you don't want to know stuff. Sometimes you don't want to know stuff because you think it's going to interfere with your ability to learn new stuff. Us teachers call it the flush effect, because after a class is over, students sometimes go through this sort of motivated forgetting where they go, you know, I want a clean bowl when I start next quarter. I want to be able to come in fresh. And so they sort of delete everything that they knew last quarter. I know I do it for my rosters. I finally learn people's names in my class, and then the quarter ends. And then I kind of have to delete those memories out of my memory bank, or else I feel like I'll have too much trouble learning the new names. And then I'll have a student in another class, you know, I had them this quarter for general psych, and then they show up for lifespan psych next quarter. And I recognize their face, because of course I have a whole region in my brain for recognizing faces, and I cannot remember their name because I flushed it when I cleared my rosters out of my brain banks. That's an example of what we call retrieval inhibition. It's still in your head, but what you're doing is trying to place it into an inaccessible state so it doesn't interfere with what you're trying to learn. Okay. That helps to explain why we can't remember things, right? Sometimes we think we've remembered things, but we may not have remembered them accurately. Your memories, like I said, are not exactly like a computer because of those things I said earlier, but also because when a computer pulls up a file, it pulls it up intact the way that it appeared the last time you pulled it up. If something's wrong with the file, it'll say the file's corrupt, I can't pull it up. It won't pull it up and stick random bits of information from other files into it. It's not going to do that, but your memory will. You'll pull up a memory and something unrelated to that memory might get pulled up at the same time, and you will incorrectly assume it must belong there. And now you store it along with the memory when you restore it. Computers don't do that. You construct your memories fresh every time you retrieve them. And so that means you're subject to things like the misinformation effect. There was a classic study done in, I think it was 1976, by a researcher at the University of Washington, Elizabeth Loftus, who showed participants a film strip of a car accident. And this is a artist's rendering of basically the damage that was present at the accident scene. So everybody saw the same exact film strip. And then they were asked to be witnesses and testify to what they saw at the accident. Half of the participants were asked how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. The other half of the participants were asked how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. So you see the question's exactly the same, except for we've got hit versus smashed into. Group A tended to remember the accident as it actually appeared. Group B tended to remember more damage at the accident. Group B was subject to this misinformation effect. Why would you have used the phrase smashed into if the cars hadn't smashed into each other? So I'm going to draw an inference from the cue that you provided and conclude that I should remember more glass and more damage to the cars than was really present. In fact, this is a little graphical depiction of the percentage of broken glass that was remembered by Group A, who heard the word hit, and Group B, who heard the word smashed into. And you see it's like, I think, more than double the amount of glass remembered at the scene by the people who heard smashed into. That's the misinformation effect. And this is a really subtle example where all we did was switch hit for smashed into. We are very subject to people providing for us cues that make us draw inferences and change our memory. Alter the way that we're seeing the scene in our mind. Source amnesia or misattribution accounts for those times where you've discussed a childhood memory with a family member and you find out that actually that wasn't a shared childhood memory, that was a book we read or a movie we saw or something like that, a dream you had. Maybe it's somebody else's story that they told you, and then they later go, I was just kidding about that. I thought you would realize. I was just kidding. That never happened. What are you talking about? Or a dream you had. Maybe a recurring dream you used to have frequently. Our memories are so fallible. They can be fed from fictional accounts, things like that. It's really surprising. Sometimes we take on a sibling's experience as our own because we've heard the family story so many times we forget who it happened to. This is all what we're talking about when we're saying source amnesia or misattribution. We think it happened to us when in fact we got the information from some other source. This is kind of scary to think how malleable our memories are, but it is. I mean, our memories are very malleable. And so it's something that we should always remember, that we should never say to ourselves, oh no, you're wrong, I remember it, this is what happened. Maybe instead we should acknowledge that we remember it happening like this, and that it's possible we're remembering it wrong. It's always disconcerting as you start to age and you start to realize you're remembering something different than your parent and that you are confident of your memory. Because when you were little, you trusted your parents to be sort of your record keepers. The people who would tell you what happened when you were little, and you could trust them that they remembered it. The first time you have an incongruity where you remember it one way and you are completely confident that that's how it happened, and your mom or your dad says, no, 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 that was your brother, or that's, you know, I remember it differently, is that moment when you realize, oh my gosh, my parents might be wrong about stuff. Oh my gosh. And that's a shocking moment. I mean, there are a lot of things that we disagree with our parents and, you know, we say we'll never be like them or whatever, but that moment when you realize they are not the authority on on your childhood, you start to really see things in a different light. We all have fallible memories. Everybody does. And so we all just have to remember that we shouldn't probably argue with other people about our shared memory. Maybe we're each remembering part of what really happened and neither one of us is right about it. All right. That concludes memory. So I will see you guys back here for the chapter on thinking, language, and intelligence.